Before we start, take a slow breath and settle in. Tonight's story follows a lone Arctic scout fighting to survive the endless polar night. No ads, no noise, just you, the cold, and the long road to dawn. If you enjoy these journeys, please subscribe and comment where you're listening from tonight. It helps more than you know. The world was dark when he woke. Dark in a way that didn't belong to night, but to the Arctic itself. A kind of darkness that pressed against his eyelids even after they opened. Snow clung to his eyelashes. Ice stiffened the fur around his hood. His breath steamed weakly, drifting upward in a slow, trembling ribbon. For a moment, he didn't move, unsure if he was awake or if the storm was still holding him somewhere in its furious grip. He tried to lift his head. Pain crawled across his neck and down one shoulder. The wind had quieted, but its memory still roared through him. He had been part of the scouts, 3 men sent ahead to check the ice conditions, to mark the safest route for the expedition's sled teams. But the storm had come out of nowhere, swallowing their voices, ripping apart the rope that tied them together, taking visibility from meters to inches. He remembered shouting. He remembered stumbling after the rope snapped. He remembered nothing after that. Now, as he pushed himself upright, snow slid off his coat in a sheet. The drift he'd slept in was deep enough to bury him if another gust came. He brushed himself off, forcing his numb hands into motion. Movement meant warmth. Warmth meant survival. He scanned the horizon, but there was no horizon to see. Everything bled into shades of blue-black and dim grey. The sky, the ground, the air, it was all one. Somewhere beyond this white emptiness lay the rest of his team. Maybe miles, maybe yards, maybe gone entirely. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Hallberg." His voice carried only a short distance before the frozen air swallowed it. He tried again. "Mikkel." Nothing. The silence felt heavy, thick. When storms ended, the Arctic never bounced back into life. It lingered in a hushed, punished stillness, as if the wind had taken the sound with it. He reached into his coat, searching for his compass. For a moment his heart stopped. His fingers found only an empty pocket. He searched again, slower this time, refusing to panic. Finally, near the lining, he found it. Cold, cracked along the rim, but intact. The needle trembled weakly. North was somewhere behind him. The expedition camp lay far north of that. But going back was suicide. The path behind him was broken, scoured flat by the storm, and twisted into unfamiliar shapes. Without landmarks, he'd wander in circles until his energy bled into the snow. South, though, south held the chance of shelter. The old supply depot, abandoned years ago, sat somewhere deep in the ice fields. He'd heard it mentioned in passing by the older scouts. A rough hut built against a ridge, stocked with tin cups, a stove too rusted to trust, and maybe a wool blanket if luck held. He stood slowly. Each joint protested. Cold clung to his bones, but he forced his body upright. He tested the wind. just a faint drift brushing across his cheek. If it stayed that way, he might make distance before the next storm. He reached into his pack for food. The pack was half full of snow. He swallowed hard. The storm must have torn it open when it threw him. Inside were bits of ice, a few broken biscuits, and a small tin of pemmican, frozen so solid he couldn't bite it yet. Not much, but enough to keep him moving. He closed the pack carefully. Every scrap mattered now. He took his first step south. The snow groaned beneath him. Each step felt like trudging through wet sand. Slow, exhausting. The Arctic didn't fight loudly. It dragged at him quietly, stealing his strength 1 inch at a time. He tried to count his breaths. In, out, in, out. Warm air clouding in front of him. But the cold stole heat, faster than he could make it. He would need shelter before night truly settled, or before he froze mid-stride. After a few minutes, he noticed something far ahead. A faint rise in the snow, barely visible in the gloom. Maybe nothing. Maybe a ridge. Maybe the first sign of stable ground. He headed toward it. Halfway there, he stumbled. His knee slammed into ice, sending pain shooting up his leg. He forced himself back up, gritting his teeth. No stopping. Not here. Not this soon. As he moved closer, the rise sharpened into shape. A long line, like a frozen wave. Good. Ridges meant snow breaks. Shelter pockets sometimes formed at their base. He reached the ridge and pressed a hand against its side. Hard ice. Thick. Good enough to block wind. He circled it until he found a small hollow where the snow dipped inward. A natural shelter. Barely big enough to crouch in, but it was something. He dropped to his knees, scraped snow aside, and curled inside. Darkness wrapped around him again, but this time it felt earned, like a small victory against the cold. He flexed his fingers, trying to coax warmth into them. His body shivered uncontrollably, but shivering meant life. He whispered to himself, "Survive until dawn." But dawn here was weeks away, and the night was only just beginning. The hollow beneath the ridge held only a whisper of warmth, but even that felt like a gift. For a few minutes, he simply breathed, letting his body tremble out the worst of the cold. A thin frost coated the inside of his hood. Each exhale drifted as a pale mist, drifting upward before being swallowed by the dark. He flexed his hands again. Pain shot through the fingertips, sharp, needling, then fading into numbness. Not good. He needed circulation, needed movement, needed heat. But heat didn't exist out here. It was something you created through stubbornness alone. He closed his eyes and listened. The Arctic night had a way of carrying everything. The groan of shifting ice, the muted crack of distant flows, the faint whine of wind slipping between ridges. But tonight, there was almost nothing, just an empty quiet that made his own heartbeat sound loud. He let his breathing steady, one thing at a time. He survived the storm. Now, he survived the night. He reached into his coat for the small tin of pemmican, hard as stone. He kept it inside his jacket, letting body heat thaw the edges. It would take a while. Time he didn't want to waste, but time he didn't have much choice about either. His leg throbbed where he'd fallen. The pain pulsed in slow waves. He lifted the pant leg slightly. No blood, but the skin beneath was bruised and swollen. Not broken, but it would slow him. He exhaled, fog blooming in the darkness. "Keep moving tomorrow," he whispered. "Just need a few hours." Few hours. It sounded simple. Out here, it wasn't. He slid farther into the hollow until snow pressed against his back. The wind shifted, brushing the open edge of the shelter and sending a cold filament through the gap. He pulled his knees to his chest, curling tight. The Arctic didn't give rest. It gave brief pauses between demands. He thought about the expedition, how the men huddled together in tents, the flicker of lamps casting long shadows against canvas. They'd notice he was missing, but the storm would have buried all tracks. They might not even search until morning, and by then he could be miles off course. He had to assume he was alone. He had to assume rescue wasn't coming. He opened his eyes again. The world outside the hollow glowed faintly. A muted blue like moonlight filtered through fog. He recognized the quality of it. Reflected light. Maybe the aurora. Maybe a break in the clouds letting starlight dance off the snow. He crawled toward the opening, careful not to disturb the fragile warmth of the hollow. Outside, the ridge cast a long, jagged shadow stretching across the plain. The sky above flickered with faint green threads. The northern lights, blurred by drifting ice crystals. Their movement was slow, gentle, eerily quiet. He watched them for a moment. The aurora reminded him that the world was larger than fear, larger than storms, larger than this night. But beauty didn't mean safety. A distant sound drifted across the ice, low, drawn out, almost like a moan. He froze. Not human, not wind. Something shifting far beneath the frozen crust. A large flow turning in the current below. Another rumble followed. Closer, deeper. He swallowed. Pressure ridges sometimes collapsed, with little warning. If the ice beneath him fractured. He backed into the hollow again, slow and steady. No sudden movements, no panicked steps. The Arctic liked to punish fear. When the sound faded, he let out a careful breath. He leaned his head back against the icy wall and closed his eyes. The aurora still pulsed beyond the ridge, lighting the snow faintly. It wasn't dawn. It never could be. Not yet. But it felt like a reminder that light still existed somewhere. He reached for the pemmican again. Softer now. He opened the tin and scraped off a small piece. It tasted bland, oily, but the calories mattered more than flavor. He ate slowly, letting each swallow warm him from the inside, even a little. He checked his compass again. The needle quivered, unsure, but still pointed north. He oriented himself mentally. The supply depot lay south, southwest, tucked against a ridge that ran diagonally through the ice fields. If he could find that ridge, he could follow it to the shelter. But in the dark, in the endless, colorless dark, finding anything felt impossible. He forced himself to plan anyway. Memory, distance, wind, landmarks. He repeated the path quietly in his head like a mantra. South-southwest, toward the long ridge, toward the depot, toward the thin hope of warmth, toward survival. He tugged his coat and shifted deeper into the hollow. His breath quickened, then steadied. Exhaustion sank over him like a heavy blanket. He let himself drift, just a little, knowing he couldn't afford true sleep, but needing something close to it. Before his eyes closed completely, he whispered into the dark, "Just make it to tomorrow." But tomorrow was a word the Arctic didn't care for. The long night stretched on, cold, endless, and waiting. He woke to the faintest prickling sensation, a warning his body delivered before his mind caught up. The kind of cold that didn't feel sharp anymore, but soft, creeping, the early stages of something far worse. His limbs resisted when he tried to move, as if the night had wrapped him in layers of frost while he drifted in that half-sleep. He forced his eyes open. The hollow was darker now. Snow had blown across the opening during the night, partially sealing it. A blessing for warmth, but a danger if it trapped him too long. He pushed at the snow with stiff arms until a pale glow filtered through again. The aurora was still alive overhead, smearing faint ribbons of green across the sky. Hours must have passed. Maybe more. Hard to tell time when the sun refused to rise. Every breath hurt now, scraping against his throat like ice shards. His stomach cramped with hunger. The small bit of pemmican he'd eaten earlier barely dented the emptiness twisting inside him. He needed more calories. He needed movement. He needed warmth. He crawled out of the hollow and stood slowly, joints cracking like brittle wood. The air bit at his face instantly. The cold had teeth today. Sharp, eager, unrelenting. The wind had shifted southward. Good. That meant his direction would be easier to track. He checked his compass. The needle wobbled, then steadied enough to use. South-southwest. The depot was somewhere beyond the far ridge he had only glimpsed in old maps and overheard conversations. A place he had never seen with his own eyes, but had to believe existed. He started walking. The snow was firmer now, the storm's chaos frozen into uneven ripples. Each step sent tiny cracks spreading beneath him, but they stopped quickly. The surface here was stable, for now. He set a rhythm. Step, exhale, step, inhale. Keep the body awake. Keep the blood moving. Minutes blurred into an hour, or what felt like an hour. The Arctic warped time, stretching it thin, then crushing it abruptly. His breath came quicker. His legs trembled, but he pushed on. After some distance, something strange appeared ahead, an uneven shadow across the snow. He slowed, narrowing his eyes. In the dim light, shadows played tricks, twisting the ground into impossible shapes. But this wasn't imagination. He approached carefully. One more step. Then his foot sank deeper than expected. He jerked back instantly. A crack snapped through the ice beneath him. Loud, sharp, alive. His pulse hammered as he crouched and brushed snow aside. A crevasse. Narrow, but deep. the kind that could swallow a man whole if he misstepped by a single inch. The opening stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the horizon like a wound in the earth. Snow concealed most of it. Thin bridges of frost, waiting to collapse under weight. His throat tightened. Storms often created these fissures, ripping the ice apart in long, deadly lines. He tested the edges with his pole. The snow sagged dangerously. He whispered, "Not this way." He studied the crevasse more closely. On the far side, the ice sloped upward, forming a raised spine, like a natural guide. If he could follow that ridge, it might lead toward the larger ridge where the depot was built. But to reach it, he'd need to cross the crevasse somewhere safer. He walked along its edge for several minutes, scanning for a narrowing. Twice he thought he saw a crossing point, only to watch the snow crumble under his probe. His breath grew unsteady. The cold gnawed at his fingers. Panic pushed at the edges of his mind, not yet strong but growing. He forced himself to slow down. Panic created mistakes. Mistakes fed the Arctic. Finally, near a cluster of ice mounds, he found a place where the crevasse pinched to only a meter wide. Still dangerous, but not impossible. He stabbed the snow with his pole. Solid. He tested again. Solid. He backed up several steps, inhaled deeply, and sprinted forward, not fast, but committed. 1 step, 2, 3. He leaped. For a heartbeat, he floated weightless in the cold air. Then, impact. His boots slammed onto the far side. The surface held. Ice groaned beneath him, but did not give way. He fell to his knees, breathing hard, the shock of fear crashing through him like a wave. He stayed there for a moment, forehead pressed against the snow, letting the relief wash through him. He stood again, slowly, legs trembling from adrenaline. Ahead, the low ridge stretched silently across the plain. A path forward, a sign of direction, real progress. He tightened his pack straps and pushed onward, 1 step at a time. Behind him, the crevasse whispered softly as a thin sheet of snow collapsed into its depths, reminding him how close he had come to vanishing into the Arctic's quiet, frozen hunger. He kept walking anyway, because every step away from that fracture was a step toward dawn, and he needed dawn more than anything. The ridge carried him onward like a frozen spine, rising and falling across the plain in long, uneven arcs. It wasn't shelter, but it was direction, something the Arctic rarely gave willingly. Snow drifted along its edges in thin, restless sheets. The wind had sharpened since he left the hollow, but it wasn't yet strong enough to slow him. He welcomed that. He needed distance today. He needed progress. He placed each step deliberately, listening for the soft groan of stressed ice beneath him. Nothing. The surface here felt firmer, thicker, as though layered with years of compressed snow. He breathed through the ache in his ribs and kept moving. Staying still too long was death. Movement meant warmth, however small. After some time, minutes, maybe an hour, something caught his eye on the untouched snow ahead, a faint trail of dimples. He crouched, brushing frost aside. Tracks, small, neat, delicate, a fox. He followed the line with his gaze. It cut diagonally across the ridge, weaving through sheltered dips before disappearing into rising drifts. The sight tightened something in his chest. Animals didn't choose random routes in the Arctic. They chose safe ones, repeating paths their bodies trusted. If he followed the trail, it might guide him through weaker sections of ice without realizing it, maybe even toward rock or shelter. He rose again, legs stiff, and followed the fox's path. It curved naturally along the ridge, avoiding steeper slopes. The wind here felt different, angled rather than direct, a sign the landscape ahead was changing. He stopped suddenly. Just beyond a small drift lay 3 objects that didn't belong to nature. Stones, stacked deliberately. A cairn. He knelt, brushing loose snow away. The stones were small but weathered, their edges rounded as if carried long distances by gloved hands. A marker, one left by men like him. Scouts, guides, survivors. His breath formed a trembling cloud. He scanned the horizon and found another shape farther ahead, barely visible. A second cairn, a mapped route. His pulse quickened. Not with joy, exactly, but with focus. Cairns meant the expedition had travelled this way. Cairns meant logic. Cairns meant human presence, however old. He pushed toward the next one, following the line as if clutching a thread back to the world. The fox tracks kept crossing in and out of the path, weaving through cover, as though the animal recognized the same safe route the men had. When he reached the second cairn, he knelt again, feeling the cold seep into his knees. He brushed the snow aside. Another marker, intact. The ridge continued ahead, widening slightly. The sky overhead shifted to a muted silver, a sign of thin clouds. Not light, never true light, but a lessening of the oppressive darkness. Enough to see a bit farther. He followed the route to a third cairn, then a fourth. They were evenly spaced, each one guiding him deeper along the ice shelf. The repetition grounded him. The cold clawing at his fingers didn't feel as overwhelming when his mind had something to focus on. At the 5th cairn, something broke the pattern. A scrap of fabric fluttered weakly beside the stones, caught on a jagged piece of ice. He picked it up. Blue wool, frayed on one side, wind-scoured, torn recently. His throat tightened. Mikkel had worn a blue wool scarf that morning, loosely tied around his pack. He joked that the colour made him look too cheerful for the Arctic. The memory felt distant and close all at once. He ran the cloth between his fingers. It was stiff with frost, but not brittle. It hadn't been here long. They had been alive after the storm struck. Alive, long enough to keep moving. A swell of feeling rushed through him. Hope, fear, something more complex than either. The Arctic didn't care about emotions, but finding a trace of another human being out here was like finding fire in the snow. He folded the cloth and stored it safely in his pocket. That small scrap meant more than warmth. It meant direction. The wind picked up suddenly, slashing across the ridge with a sharper edge. The sky lowered another shade, the silver deepening toward grey. Another storm was approaching. He scanned the terrain desperately, searching for the next cairn before visibility dropped. After a tense moment, he spotted it. A small shape, half swallowed by drifting snow. He pushed forward. Each step demanded more energy than the last. The cold crawled into his sleeves and boots, tugging at his strength, whispering that stopping would be easier. He refused the thought. He reached the sixth cairn just as snow began sweeping sideways in fine, stinging sheets. The fox tracks vanished instantly. The horizon dissolved. The world shrank to the space in front of him. But he had the markers now. A path cut by others. A line through the chaos. He pulled his hood tight and continued. And somewhere ahead, somewhere hidden in the endless dark, lay the next piece of survival. The storm thickened slowly, building itself layer by layer until the world became a blur of white and wind. The cairns guiding him had grown harder to spot. Each one seemed to materialize only when he was nearly touching it, half buried beneath restless drifts. He kept his hood low, eyes narrowed, breath steaming into the cold. His legs ached from hours of trudging. The cold had settled deep into his joints, making every motion feel heavy. But he had no choice. Slowing down meant surrendering warmth. Stopping meant surrendering life. At the next cairn, he crouched to catch his breath. Snow whipped past him, stinging his cheeks. He reached into his pack for a piece of pemmican, forcing his stiff fingers to rip it free. The taste was bland, but the calories mattered more than flavour. As he rose again, something in the snow caught his attention. A print, large, deep, edges crisp despite the storm. A polar bear. He felt the cold move from outside his body to inside his chest. Bears roamed these regions often, following seal routes or scraps left behind by expeditions. But sometimes, especially in winter, they followed people. Hunger drove them closer, made them bold. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. Only the storm, shifting and swallowing distances. Still, he could almost feel eyes on him. He forced himself forward. The basin ahead had lower winds, the ridge bending into a sheltered corridor. He dropped down carefully, boots sliding on packed snow. The wind softened as soon as he reached the bottom. Relief, brief but real, slid across him. But the quiet down here wasn't comforting. Sound carried strangely in the basin, muffled under the weight of drifting snow. His own footsteps came back to him in faint, warped echoes. He tapped the ice with his pole, listening for hollow tones that warned of crevasses. The ground seemed stable, for now. He found another cairn tucked against a mound. As he brushed snow from its stones, he found another print beside it. Another bear track. Fresh. Not minutes old, but not hours either. The bear was following the same route he was. Whether by chance or design didn't matter. It meant danger walked the trail with him. He tightened the straps of his pack and moved faster. The sky dimmed further as the storm gathered strength. Snow drifted sideways, forcing him to squint. The ridge walls around the basin rose higher, their edges dissolving into the white haze. For a moment, he lost the feeling of direction entirely. His compass trembled in his grip, needle twitching from the static in the air. He tapped the ice again, thick, solid. He pressed on. After several minutes, time felt warped here. He reached another cairn farther along the basin. The stones leaned at an angle under weight of snow. He brushed them clear and straightened, breath fogging in front of him. A sound carried through the wind, soft, crunching, measured. He froze. Footsteps, not human, not fox, heavy. He turned slowly, trying to see through the swirling white behind him. Shapes moved as a storm, but nothing held form long enough to identify. Shadows flickered, then dissolved. His pulse drummed at his temples. The bear could be yards away, or a mile. The crunch came again, closer. He backed up instinctively, boots sliding slightly. He gripped his pole tight, though he knew it would do little against a full-grown bear. Fighting was death. Running was worse. Only caution and luck kept a man alive out here. The wind surged suddenly, sweeping a wave of snow into the corridor. For a moment, the storm lifted just enough to reveal a shape at the far edge. Tall, pale, moving with slow deliberation. His breath caught. Then the white swallowed the shape again, erasing it completely. He didn't wait. He turned and pushed forward, deeper into the basin, forcing his legs into a steadier rhythm. The storm thickened behind him, the wind's howl rising like a warning. He searched frantically for the next cairn, eyes burning from the cold. When he finally spotted it, it felt like the last lighthouse in a drowning sea. He reached it and crouched, chest heaving. The bear hadn't shown itself again. But the tracks, the sounds, the fleeting silhouette, all of it pressed against his mind, urging him forward. He looked around the basin, searching for shelter. The walls around him rose into uneven ridges. One had a pocket beneath it, a small hollow where snow had packed tightly against an ice overhang. It wasn't ideal, but it was cover. He scrambled into the hollow, scraping snow aside until he had space to curl inside. The cold still bit at him, but the wind dulled instantly. Outside, something moved again. Soft, slow, deliberate. He held his breath, listening. Nothing. Then a distant grunt, low, deep, real. The bear was still out there. The storm raged around them both, but the darkness between hunter and hunted was growing thinner. He curled tighter, breath shallow. The night was far from over. The whiteout closed around him until the world became nothing but motion. Snow lifting, falling, twisting in patterns too fast to follow. The ridge behind him was already disappearing, swallowed by drifting sheets of white. He tightened his hood, gripped his pole, and pushed forward before the storm erased all sense of direction. He focused on memory. The last cairn sat slightly left of the ridge's crest, pointing toward a higher rise. If he drifted even a few meters off course, the storm would claim the path completely. He tapped the ice ahead of each step, testing for weak spots, letting the pole guide him more than sight. His breath fogged instantly, freezing on the scarf around his mouth, his eyelashes crusted with frost. But he kept moving, repeating silently, "Find the next marker, one at a time." It took several long minutes before he saw anything. A faint lump in the snow, a darker shadow beneath movement. He approached slowly, heart thudding. A cairn, nearly buried but intact. He brushed the snow away with careful motions and kept moving. Confidence rose, not warmth, but something close. He had not drifted off course. The storm hadn't stolen the path entirely. The ridge changed beneath him, narrowing, then rising into a sharper spine. The wind struck harder at the top, but visibility improved slightly. The ice here was older, shaped by seasons of pressure, offering a more stable surface. He followed the ridge crest, boots crunching through wind-packed snow. Another cairn appeared, then another. Each one a small victory. His body hurt everywhere. His legs trembled intermittently, and his fingers burned before dulling into a dangerous numbness. He flexed them constantly to bring sensation back. The storm clawed at him, but his pace remained steady. This section of the ridge seemed to run straight, offering long, uninterrupted progress. Eventually, the ridge dropped sharply into a slope. Beyond it lay a wide plain, open, exposed, and unsettling in its emptiness. But the depot's ridge system was rumored to lie somewhere beyond such plains. This was a sign he was closing in. He descended carefully, testing each patch of ice. Small cracks webbed across the surface, shallow but easy to trip on. At the base, the wind softened. The plain was smoother, though stretches of snow drifted in uneven ridges. He scanned the distance and saw it. A cairn standing low against the storm, almost absorbed by the blur. It was farther than the others, but visible. He started across the plain. Wind swept sideways, pushing against him steadily. He lowered his head and leaned into each gust. The snow was deeper here, dragging at his boots, but mostly firm underneath. He focused on the cairn, the way a drowning man focuses on a rope. Halfway across, the wind surged violently, momentarily erasing the marker. Panic flared, but he forced himself to keep moving in the same direction. Seconds later, the cairn re-emerged through the white haze. He reached it trembling, breath tearing through his chest. He crouched and steadied himself with a gloved hand on the cold stones. The storm roared overhead, but the cairn meant he had crossed the most vulnerable stretch, without losing direction. He looked up, scanning the swirling white for the next landmark. Nothing yet, but he knew it would be there. The route had been deliberate so far. This was the pattern of a team trying to survive, not wander. He flexed his fingers again, forced warmth into them, and rose. He wasn't safe. The night wasn't easing. The storm wasn't finished. But he had crossed a plain he had no right to cross in weather like this. He took one step forward, then another, pushing deeper into the whiteout. Not because the path was clear, but because it existed, and because stopping wasn't an option. The storm did not fade suddenly. It weakened in uneven pulses, like a great breath slowing rather than stopping. Snow still swept across the plain, but the whiteout loosened its grip, revealing the faint shapes of distant ridges. He lifted his head, blinked away frost, and realized he could see farther than he had in hours, only a few dozen meters. But in the Arctic, that might as well have been miles. He breathed slowly, keeping his rhythm calm. The rush of relief tempted him to move too fast, but he steadied himself. Progress didn't matter if he burned the last of his energy. The depot, if it existed where he believed, would sit near the base of the next major ridge. Reaching that ridge meant everything. He scanned the plain one more time, searching for the next cairn. Snow gusted sideways, flattening briefly before lifting again. For a moment, he thought the storm had erased the path. Then he saw it. A small, dark shape perched on a low rise, half visible between sweeping gusts. He trudged toward it, legs heavy but determined. His body had begun moving on instinct alone, each step a negotiation between exhaustion and necessity. When he reached the cairn, he placed a hand on it to steady himself. The stones were rimmed with ice, but intact. Safety wasn't guaranteed by these markers, but direction was. Ahead, the ridge loomed higher, more defined than the smaller ones he had crossed. Its shape curved upward like a long frozen dune. Visibility again shifted. The storm pressed in from behind, urging him toward the ridge's cover. He climbed. The slope was steeper than expected. Snow deepened near the crest, forcing him to lift his legs higher and plant his feet more firmly. His breath rasped in the scarf across his mouth. The wind hammered at his side in long bursts, nearly knocking him off balance. He leaned forward and used the pole as an anchor, stabbing it deep into the snow with each step. Halfway up, the wind paused. He straightened slightly. A sound rolled across the ridge, deep, distant, vibrating through the ice more than the air. Not thunder, not the storm. Ice shifting under pressure. Somewhere far beneath him, the Arctic was stretching and settling, reshaping itself in ways both ancient and indifferent. He climbed faster. At the ridge's crest, the ground leveled out into a narrow spine that stretched into the haze. He scanned the horizon. The storm had pushed low clouds westward, revealing a strange glow on the eastern side of the sky. A thin, cold sheen illuminating the snow. Not sunrise, but reflected light from the aurora above the cloud line. It allowed him to see something faint in the distance. A second ridge, longer, taller, running nearly parallel to the one he stood on. That had to be it. The major ridge the older scouts had described. The depot had been built somewhere near its base, tucked beside an outcrop of rock that was supposedly the only exposed stone for miles. If he could reach that ridge, he would know for the first time that he was close. He descended carefully from the crest. The lee side was gentler, shielded slightly from the wind. The snow here was smoother, with fewer drifts. His strength ebbed, but the thought of the depot, of any shelter at all, kept him steady. He reached the plain between the ridges and paused. A long, open stretch. The storm was shifting again, gathering behind him. He could feel the wind building in short pulses, pushing him toward the next rise. He pressed forward. The plain felt endless. He stopped once, leaned heavily on his pole, and forced himself to breathe slower. His legs trembled, the cold deepening into his bones. His mind wandered into dangerous territory, brief flashes of warmth that didn't exist, memories of tents and campfires, the feeling of mittens thawing near a stove. He blinked hard and straightened. The depot was real. The ridge was real. The cairns had led him this far. He would not stop now. As he neared the base of the major ridge, he saw something half buried in the snow, a cluster of small stones. Not a cairn, more like rubble. He knelt and brushed frost away. Debris, splintered wood, a broken length of rope, a rusted hook, signs of human presence. His chest tightened, not quite relief, not fear, something in between. The storm might be erasing the world behind him, but the land ahead held pieces of others who walk this path. Whether they survived or not didn't matter right now. What mattered was proof that this place wasn't imagination or hope. It had been real to others too. He rose again. The ridge towered above him. Beyond it, somewhere hidden in its folds, lay the depot. He gripped his pole, tightened his pack straps, and climbed. The storm howled behind him, but he didn't look back. For the first time since the night began, he felt close to something. Shelter, safety, or simply an answer to whether the world still contained warmth at all. The climb toward the major ridge tested everything he had left. The slope wasn't steep at first, but the snow deepened with every step, dragging at his legs and making the ridge feel impossibly far. He leaned hard on his pole, lifting each foot through the heavy drifts, breathing through tight pain in his ribs. The storm pressed against him the entire way. Not a full whiteout, but thick swirls of snow that narrowed the world into a shifting tunnel. The ridge crest vanished and reappeared in the gusts, always looking a little farther than before. He kept his head low and moved steadily upward. Near the top, the wind grew sharper. It struck in solid bursts, pushing him sideways. He carved small footholds with each step, using the pole as an anchor. When he finally reached the crest, he stopped only long enough to catch a shaking breath, then froze. On the far side, shapes broke the uniform white. Dark, jagged silhouettes scattered at the base of the ridge. Rocks. Actual, exposed rock. The depot was built near the only rock formations for miles. That had been drilled into every scout. The sight of those dark shapes cut through his exhaustion like a blade of clarity. He descended the opposite side carefully. Snow thinned on the lee slope, revealing wind-polished ice that forced him to move with deliberate control. The ridgeline funneled wind downward, but the rock formations ahead provided pockets of shelter. He pressed toward them, feeling the storm shift at his back. As he reached the first cluster of rocks, he scanned the wind-sheltered recesses along their sides. The shapes offered better cover than anything he'd found since leaving the hollow. In the deepest recess, a faint scuff mark caught his eye. A shallow drag across the snow. A boot print, softened but real. He crouched and brushed the frost aside. Someone had stood here recently, maybe hours earlier. The others had made it this far. He followed the outcrop slowly. In the next indentation, half filled with snow, he found a scrap of pale canvas caught against a stone, torn but stiff. He tucked it into his pocket. Every trace strengthened the line of direction and kept him from slipping into doubt. He rose and looked beyond the rocks. There, faint but unmistakable, a straight edge cut through the storm. Then another, a slanted shape, a vertical line, a structure. His breath caught. The depot, or what remained of it. It sat farther along the ridge, partially hidden by blowing snow. The outline vanished, then reappeared between gusts. He moved toward it immediately, legs trembling, but determined. The storm clawed at him, but he felt something close to momentum for the first time all night. The ridge curved gently, and with each turn he caught another glimpse. More detail now. A broken post. A roofline pitched under weight of ice. The faint angle of a storage wall. It wasn't large, but it was enough. A shelter. Supplies. A place to climb into and breathe without freezing. He crossed the ridge base faster, driven by that fragile burst of energy. The wind grew violent for a moment, lifting loose snow into a spinning curtain. The depot vanished again in the blur, but he knew exactly where he'd seen it last. He crouched, letting the gust pass, then continued forward. His legs shook harder now. His breaths came in ragged bursts, but the rocks pressed behind him like a reminder. He wasn't imagining the structure. He wasn't walking in circles. The path had led here. Closer now, he could see wooden slats half buried in the snow. A piece of metal siding leaning at an angle. He reached out and touched one of the boards, feeling splintered grain through the frost. The storm groaned across the ridge, but his mind steadied. Then, carried on the wind, something faint reached his ears. Not the bear, not the ice, a voice, or the echo of one. He held still, listening. Nothing. Just the storm, reshaping sound into strange shapes. He let out a shaky breath. Real or imagined, it didn't matter. The depot was ahead, and he was going to reach it. The depot took shape slowly as he approached, emerging from the storm like a memory forcing itself into clarity. What first looked like drifting shadows resolved into solid forms. Angled boards, collapsed beams, fractured metal sheets pinned under frozen drifts. It wasn't the orderly supply station he'd imagined. It looked battered, half swallowed, nearly forgotten. But it was real, and it was standing. He moved toward the nearest wall, boots sinking through a fresh crust of snow. The wind cut along the ridge in sharp, pulsing waves. Every gust rattled loose planks, and sent hollow knocks echoing across the structure, as if the building exhaled after years of holding its breath. He reached out and touched the siding. The wood felt icy, but reassuring under his glove, reminding him that this place had been built by hands like his, hands that fought storms, hands that believed the ridge could be tamed long enough to hold supplies, warmth, maybe even hope. He leaned against the wall and let himself breathe. The storm surged again, pushing snow across the ground in thin veils. He rounded the corner of the depot, searching for an entrance. The main door should have faced south, away from the worst winds, but drifts had piled high on that side. He tapped the snowpack with his pole, solid enough to climb. He scrambled up the bank, careful to stay balanced. From the top, he spotted the outline of the door, half buried and canted slightly off its hinges. He dropped to his knees and began clearing snow from the frame. The effort stole what little strength remained in him. His gloves stiffened and his breath turned ragged, but he kept scraping until the wood revealed itself fully. He tugged on the handle. The door didn't budge. He dug deeper, freeing the lower edge. A second attempt. Still stuck. He pressed his forehead against the cold wood and inhaled slowly, letting the storm's roar fade into a background hum. Then he shifted his grip and pulled again, harder. The hinges groaned. Snow cracked loose, and with a sudden lurch, the door gave way enough for him to squeeze through. He slipped inside. The difference in the air was immediate. Still cold, frigid even, but still. No wind clawing at him, no snow spiraling around his ankles. Just silence, thick and muffled, like the depot had sealed itself off from the world long ago. He closed the door behind him as best he could. Inside, the space was dim, lit only by the faintest grey light leaking through frost-covered slats. Rows of broken crates lined the walls. Some had collapsed entirely, their contents scattered in frozen heaps. He knelt beside one and brushed frost away, searching for labels, dried rations, fuel tablets, spare fabric, tools. Anything would matter. Most boxes were empty. He swallowed, steadying himself. This place wasn't meant to be fully stocked year-round. Storms hit it often. Scavengers, animal or human, could strip a depot bare in a single season. But something here had to remain. He moved deeper inside. A shelving rack leaned crookedly against the far wall. On its middle shelf, an old tin can sat upright, its metal dull with age. He lifted it. A ration tin, light but not empty. He cracked it open with stiff fingers. Inside lay a small portion of compressed food, hard as stone but edible. He nearly laughed. He pocketed the ration and moved on. At the back of the depot, tucked behind a slumped tarp, he found something more valuable than food. A rusted lantern with an intact glass housing. He shook it gently. No sloshing, no fuel. But the wick was clean. The lantern itself, once thawed, could work. His heart beat faster. A lantern meant heat, light, a chance to dry gloves, warm fingers, thaw a ration. He turned to search for fuel, when a noise crackled through the silence. Soft, delicate, a shifting weight on snow outside the wall. He froze. The wind? A drifting board? Or something else? He leaned closer to the wall, listening. Nothing. Then, again, faint, deliberate, and slow. He breathed shallowly, forcing calm into his chest. The storm outside had quieted just enough for sounds to travel. The depot's walls weren't thick. Every movement outside echoed differently, carrying uncertainty with it. He stepped away from the wall, keeping to the center of the room. The depot wasn't perfectly secure. Holes in the siding let in thin veins of icy air. If something prowled outside, it could smell warmth long before he actually had any. He reached into his pack, pulling out the canvas scrap he'd found earlier. He stared at it, then at the lantern, then at the shadowed corners of the depot. He wasn't safe yet, but he was inside. He had shelter. He had food. He had a lantern one step away from being useful, and he was closer to surviving the night than he had been at any moment since leaving the hollow. He let out a long breath, then knelt to search for fuel, because dawn was still far off, and warmth wouldn't make itself. He found the fuel in a place so ordinary it nearly made him laugh. A narrow crate wedged behind the door, half crushed under fallen boards. A faded label clung to its side, the lettering barely readable. Emergency lamp oil. He pried it open with his knife, breath shaking. Inside sat 2 metal canisters, both dented but intact, their caps frozen in place. He worked the first cap loose slowly, warming it between his hands until it cracked open with a faint pop. A thin scent of fuel drifted out, sharp, chemical, promising heat. He poured a cautious amount into the lantern's reservoir, watching the wick darken as it absorbed the liquid. His fingers trembled with a mix of cold and anticipation. He struck the flint. Once, nothing. Twice, a spark. On the third strike, flame caught, tiny and wavering, before blooming into a small, steady light. Warmth followed instantly, not enough to heat the room, but enough to soften the biting air around the lantern. Shadows shifted across the depot walls in slow, comforting movements. He cupped his hands near the glass, letting the heat brush his skin. Sensation returned painfully, pins and needles crawling across his fingers. But he welcomed it. He sat for a moment beside the lantern, letting his breathing steady. Outside, the storm still muttered along the ridge, but its fury had lessened. The howls were quieter now, more distant, as if the night itself were losing strength. He unwrapped the ration tin and held the compressed food near the lantern's glow. The edges softened slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He ate slowly, breaking the ration into small bites. Each swallow felt heavy, grounding. His body soaked up the calories with desperate gratitude. When he finished, he leaned back against a crate and listened to the depot's quiet sounds. The faint creak of wood adjusting to temperature, the soft hiss of the lantern's flame, the occasional groan of wind slipping through cracks. The world felt smaller in here, contained, no longer a spinning white void. He let his eyes close for a moment, not to sleep, He couldn't risk that yet, but to let exhaustion ease its grip for a few breaths. A faint crunch outside snapped them open again. He sat perfectly still. Another crunch. Soft. Slow. Moving along the depot wall. He held his breath. Not the storm. Not shifting snow. Something with weight. The sound paused near the door. Then silence. His muscles tensed. He reached for his pole, not as a weapon, but as reassurance. The lantern flickered gently, casting trembling shadows. He waited, every breath painfully slow. Then, nothing. The silence stretched, long, unbroken. Eventually, he exhaled. The sound, whatever it had been, didn't return. Maybe the storm had thrown debris against the siding. Maybe the shifting temperature made the snow settle oddly. Or maybe something had passed by the depot, considering the warm air inside, and moved on. He didn't know. But the night no longer felt like it was closing in. It felt like it was preparing to loosen. He rose slowly and checked the lantern again. The flame burned steady. Fuel remained. He set the lantern in a safer spot, away from tarps and loose fabric, then cleared a small area near the corner of the room where the floor looked stable. There, he spread his coat and pack, creating a small nest of insulation. He curled onto it carefully, keeping his boots on, his gloves loosely fitted, so he could move quickly if needed. He pulled his scarf up to his chin. The lantern's light painted soft gold across the interior, turning the broken crates into gentle silhouettes. The depot walls blocked the wind almost completely now. Only a faint hum seeped through the boards. He let his breathing settle. Not deep sleep, just drifting rest. The kind that keeps you aware of the cold but lets your body recover. He leaned his head against the pack and let the rhythm of the lantern flame lull his mind into something calmer. Outside, the storm continued to weaken. The wind thinned into long, sighing breaths. The occasional flakes that drifted through cracks sparkled briefly before melting on the lantern's warmth. Hours passed this way, half awake, half resting, the long night finally showing signs of retreat. Then, at last, the faintest glow touched the slats of the depot window. Not bright, not warm, but different. A greyness that suggested distance, a lifting of darkness, a beginning. He pushed himself upright, joints stiff, breath heavy. He moved toward the door and wedged it open a few inches. The storm had passed. The sky above the ridge held a soft band of pale light, the first sign of morning. He stood in the doorway, lantern behind him, cold rising around him, but no longer biting with the same merciless edge. He had survived the night. Not safely, not easily, but fully. And with dawn beginning its slow return, the way forward, whatever it held, felt possible again.